When you think of crime in the UK, especially murder, you typically think of it being committed with someone using a deadly weapon, whether it be a knife or a blunt instrument. What you don't often connect the UK with is mass shootings. Our gun laws are very stringent here, but for good reason. Did you know that in the 80s there were a string of mass shootings, and it was those which led to an update of the Firearms Act 1968 in 1988, as a result mainly because of the Hungerford massacre. On August 19, 1987, Michael Ryan shot and killed 16 people before turning the gun on himself. Another notable incident was the Dunblane shooting in Scotland at a primary school, a really devastating one. But in this video, I'm going to talk about one you probably haven't heard of. This is the story of the Monkseaton shootings. Hello everyone, welcome to British Murders. I am your host, Stuart Blues. This is the podcast where we discuss British murder cases suggested by my listeners. And this week, as I said, we are in Monkseaton. Located in the North Tyneside town of Whitley Bay, is about 3 miles west of South Shields, 7 miles north of Newcastle upon Tyne, and about 250 miles north of England's capital city of London. The population, about 36,000 people according to the 2011 census, is quite a quaint and small area of Whitley Bay, located right next to the sea, as you would imagine by the name of the town. And it's basically a northern seaside area, people go about their business, not much really happens up there. However, it has long been living in the shadow of the Monkseaton shootings which occurred in 1989, 35 years ago. Now, on the back of the Firearms Amendment Act being brought in 1988, on the tail end of that year, it was said that between February 1st and April 30th, 1989, there would be kind of a transitional period for gun owners to turn in their unlicensed weapons. If you go and read that act, it states that there are various types of weapons which were now outlawed. You needed a license for certain weapons as well. You had to be over the age of 17. All these new rules got introduced. What you had to do if you owned a weapon and you wanted to obey the law, I'm sure many people didn't, you had to either take it to your local police station or to a professional firearms expert to have it deactivated. It was on that final day, April 30th, 1989, where our story begins. In a house on a quaint little cul-de-sac in Wentworth Gardens, there was a 22-year-old man waking up to a freshly made breakfast by his mum and dad, eggs and sausages no less, because they thought it would be nice to treat him as they were going away to the Yorkshire Dales for a bit of a caravan trip, and he was the only one left in the house. He wasn't their only child, he had an older brother called Andrew, but he lived away on his own and he was serving in the Royal Navy, just like this 22-year-old's dad Brian had in the past. It's worth noting at this point that his dad and brother were both weapons experts in the Navy. Robert Sartin was the name of this 22-year-old, and as far as his parents knew, he had plans for the rest of the day. He was going out with a 17-year-old girl at the time, the daughter of a policeman, and he planned to meet her for lunch and then spend the rest of the afternoon just moseying about and enjoying the nice weather. Sartin was a pretty shy guy by all accounts, so his mates sort of took the piss out of him when they realised he had a girlfriend because he was just so out of character. He met her at the local grocery store where his mum worked, but if we're looking at this realistically, it was her that likely set up this interaction between him and his girlfriend. She instigated the whole thing. Sartin was a polite lad. He's the guy that everyone on the neighbourhood said they wished was their son. He was essentially a perfect gentleman. He'd walk down the street holding his girlfriend's hands. He had a car, a respectable job, and he had a lot to live for. He was considering upgrading his car. He'd recently joined a local fitness club, paying an annual membership. So there were no signs here to suggest that he had any nefarious plans, not just for that day, but for his near future. There were no family disagreements that morning. He wasn't on bad terms with his girlfriend. So what happened next is really strange without further context, but I will come to that later in the video. With his parents leaving for the Yorkshire Dales at around 8:30 that morning, Sartin left at about 20 to 12. He got in his car and went for a drive, but he wasn't empty-handed. He took with him his dad's double-barreled shotgun, plenty of spare ammunition, and a hunting knife which he strapped to one of his legs. As he headed out of the cul-de-sac and headed towards Piccadilly Road, the first person that came across him was 43-year-old Judith Rhodes, who was driving along in a car of her own. Sartin had parked up on the side of the road, and as she was driving towards him, he aimed the shotgun at Judith's windscreen and fired the weapon, shattering it completely. Some sources claim that Judith was parked on the side of the road and not driving. She was waiting for her husband by all accounts, but whether or not the car was moving is kind of irrelevant. What we do know is that after that first shot, she ducked for cover as anyone would. Sartin walked round the side of the vehicle and shot once more, this time injuring Judith's hand. As he continued his journey on foot, Sartin headed towards Windsor Road, where he spotted a man and a woman having a jovial conversation. Lorraine Noble and Frank Roberts were neighbours, friendly neighbours. They chatted regularly, especially at the bottom of Frank's garden, and when they spotted Sartin walking towards them, they didn't really even feel the need to double take. It was just another person. Granted, they might not have recognised him, but why would they have paid him any more attention? Before they knew what was happening, Sartin opened fire on both of them, injuring Lorraine gravely in the process. She somehow managed to drag her way inside despite her bad injuries, and she would go on to survive the attack, with Frank also ducking for cover and scrambling back into his own house. Frank's first thought was to lock his door, obviously. He then went and grabbed his camera, and from his window started taking pictures of Sartin, who continued his journey with the fully loaded shotgun around the nearby streets. He then came across James and Joan Kernahan, who were having a chat with their neighbour and friend William Dack. All three of them managed to scarper quickly when Sartin unloaded on them. It doesn't appear as if they were injured greatly, if they were injured at all, and they managed to escape with their life, thankfully. However, I can't say the same about the next person that Sartin came across. 41-year-old Kenneth Mackintosh was a devout Methodist, and on the morning of April 30th, he'd gone to Monkseaton Methodist Church as he did every week with his wife Pamela. He was raised a Methodist, his mum was a devout one also, and it sort of shaped him into the kind and giving man that he became. The married couple had 2 children, 16-year-old Roger and 22-year-old Debbie. And it was through not only his religion, but his charitable work, his work in the community, how he set such a good example for his 2 kids. He was well liked and respected within the Monkseaton Methodist congregation, but it was everyone in the local area who knew him fondly. They'd call him Ken, that was his affectionate name, and seeing as though he ran a youth club, all the youngsters used to call him Uncle Ken, a name I'm sure brought him a smile every time he heard it. A natural leader, he was also an assistant scoutmaster at the 21st Whitley Bay Scouts, and when he wasn't volunteering in the local community, he was working as a manager for British Telecom at their Gosforth exchange in Newcastle. He'd worked in the communications industry ever since leaving secondary school, and at BT he'd worked his way up to becoming a manager, a role he secured in roughly 1985, so at the time of this story he's been in that role for about 4 years. Like his friends and neighbours, his colleagues absolutely adored Ken. They loved working with him, loved working for him, and you know as well as me, that's not something everyone can say about their boss. He'd recently become a granddad. Debbie and her husband welcomed a child to the world not long before this story's events. So, like Sartin, he had a lot to live for, a lot to look forward to, and his life was going exceedingly well. Typically what would happen on the Sunday service is that Pamela and Kenneth would go in the car and go home by car. But on that day, it seems as if Pamela took a couple of other churchgoers home and Kenneth instead decided to walk the short way back. On his way, he could give out some flyers for the church to people passing by or perhaps putting them through people's letterboxes. It was as he made his way home on Windsor Road that he was confronted walking in the other direction by Robert Sartin, who from a distance of about 20 yards unleashed 2 shots which downed Kenneth immediately. Casually reloading and walking up to the now downed Kenneth, whose chest was on the floor, Sartin unleashed 2 more rounds into his back from point-blank range. He died pretty much instantly. When his post-mortem was conducted by Dr. Harvey McTaggart, it was confirmed that his cause of death was due to a ruptured heart and aorta caused by the shotgun blast. Kenneth Mackintosh was the only fatality that day, however Sartin didn't stop there. 38-year-old Robert Wilson, or Bob, was shot by Sartin in the face and back, with a total of 60 shotgun pellets being lodged in his body, only 10 of which could be removed, meaning, do the maths, 50 remained. Despite the intense amount of pain he must have been in, he went inside, gave himself a quick once-over in the mirror, before remembering that his fiancée Leslie Pugh was out on a walk. Worrying that she could come across Sartin and be shot, he quickly ran out to find her and brought her home to safety. There are some images of Bob's wounds. I won't put them on here for obvious reasons, but if you do want to seek them out, they can be found quite easily. Kathleen Lynch was the next person fired at by Sartin. She went outside to see what all the commotion was, but after quickly re-entering her home and locking the door, she was fired at through the window, causing an injury to her shoulder. The next person injured was Brian Toms, who was riding his bicycle at the time. Sartin shot at him, causing him to fall from his bike, with him sustaining injuries to his chest, arms, legs, and abdomen. Now, of all the people Sartin came across that day, only one of them was granted mercy. 75-year-old Vera Burrows came outside. Again, she didn't know what was going on, and Sartin walked across her path. She asked him, "What the hell are you doing?" To which he replied, "I'm killing people today, but you're old, so I'll let you off." With that, he continued his journey. Vera was stood in shock and eventually went back inside, not knowing what the hell had just happened. Just down the road from Vera was Jane and Clive Pickerel. At the front of their house, the kids would normally play out together. Their stepson Mark, who was 7, would play footy with his mates. What Jane noticed, though, was that there were a load of cars going past. It looked quite busy for reasons she wasn't aware of yet, so she ordered the boys inside, took them to the back garden, where it was a lot safer. Within a few minutes, Sartin walked across the front of their property, and it was at that point they realised just how lucky they were. Clive then called the police, but the switchboard was so busy he couldn't actually get through. So many people throughout the local neighbourhood had called the police, so much so that 5 ambulances were dispatched to the area. John Sampson and Chris Gandy were the first paramedics to arrive at the scene, and as they tried to attend to Kenneth, they were shot at by Sartin. Taking cover as best they could, they quickly got back in the ambulance and drove away from the area, picking up 3 people on the way and treating their wounds, minor ones, in the ambulance. Peter and Jean Bergen were then fired at in their car and managed to escape with minor, if any, injuries at all. I believe their daughter was also in the car with them. And after that, Kathleen Miley, a 64-year-old churchgoer, was then shot and downed by Sartin. Shortly after that, a christening ended at St Andrew's United Reformed Church. Opening the doors, Reverend Tom Grant spotted the body of Kathleen Miley across the road, and Angela Bartle, a churchgoer with no regard for her own safety, quickly ran out to Kathleen's aid before she soon heard what she thought was far too loud to be a car backfire. It was Sartin, and noticing that he was reloading his shotgun, she too dived for cover behind a car before safely making her way back inside the church. Sartin would soon leave the area in his car, but before he did so, he shot Ernest Carter in the back of the legs, Roy Brown through the windscreen of his car, and Jean Miller in her stomach, which caused devastating injuries that saw her being placed into intensive care for a good period after. Police Constable Danny Herdman was off duty at the time in an unmarked police car, and after hearing the commotion on the radio, he noticed a Ford going past which was being driven by who he thought was the perpetrator, and as it so happened, it was Sartin driving the car fleeing the scene. Through those quiet streets, a 60-mile-an-hour car chase occurred before Sartin and his Ford Escort finally pulled into the car park at Brian Dean, a local restaurant. As PC Herdman got out and apprehended him, Sartin offered no resistance. Seconds later, a horde of police cars entered the car park, securing the area properly, and offering PC Herdman some backup, not that he needed it. Inside the car, officers found the fully loaded shotgun, all the spare ammunition, and the hunting knife. He was arrested at 12:17 p.m. that day. That was just 15 minutes after the first call to the emergency services was made at 12:02. If you're keeping count, the total number of injured people was 17. There was 1 fatality, Kenneth Mackintosh, and if there was a child in the car with the Bergens, that would take it to 18. When Kenneth's funeral took place on Friday, May 5th, the reported 500 people attended. That's how much everyone loved that guy in the local community. The mayor of Hungerford had even written to his family to express her condolences, and her letter was read out during the proceedings. A wreath shaped like a snooker table, that was clearly one of his hobbies, was left with messages from his friends and family. His daughter Debbie left a poem. It read, "I'm still asking why, but still no reply. The memories you have left are the best. No, Dad, don't worry, just rest. Roger's message simply read, I love you. All my love, Roger. P.S. Why? And that was the poignant question on everybody's lips. What had prompted this quiet, neighborhood-friendly, community-loving guy with a respectable job to commit such a heinous act in the quiet area? Based on what we know about him, it seemed so out of character. Nobody could understand and put two and two together to make four. Everyone was getting 5. His father, Brian, felt remorseful because it was him who encouraged his youngest son to be interested in weapons, just like he was, just like his older brother was, but they never shot anything live. They didn't shoot game. Brian was a member of a clay pigeon shooting club, and he would sometimes take Sartin down there, and he did admit that he was quite a good shot. But even so, Brian was into weapons. He represented his country in the Navy. So did his eldest son, Andrew. Neither of them did what Sartin did. It's only when you look back on his secondary school years that things start to make a little bit of sense. From as young as 13, he was having problems with an obsession with the occult and Satanism. His RE teacher once did an end-of-year report explaining that his work was so heavily influenced by occultism and Satanism that it just wasn't appropriate for the lesson. He would do drawings to accompany these rituals he was describing, really out there stuff. His English literature teacher did a similar report a year later, and they said that his interest in violence and women violence and Satanism again, interest in the devil and paganism and witchcraft, all the stuff that's considered taboo, was far too prevalent. By August 1982, a 15-year-old Sartin was referred to a child psychologist. Not only was his interest in Satanism revealed, but he also had a dark interest in sadomasochism. He said he'd often fantasized about murdering his parents, with the voices in his head being the ones who were trying to convince him to do so. He'd collect loads of nefarious books on, the Second World War from the German perspective, the camps people were forced to stay in, and again, the torture of women was something he was particularly interested in. This was a guy that was so into horror films that people used to refer to him as Satan. Now, his name was Sartin, of course, so it's kind of a play on words. It rolls off the tongue just like his name. But one of the reasons people called him that, apparently, was because he had a resemblance for Damien from the film The Omen. He loved it. He reveled in being called Satan, so much so that he would go around and say, I am the devil. It's clear from what I'm saying here that there was something inside Sartin that was yet to be discovered. We have to remember, for context, this was in the early 80s, so mental health and its awareness wasn't as prevalent as it is now. It doesn't excuse it. I just want to set the context, so if you're wondering, couldn't this have been stopped? Why didn't they realise that perhaps he had mental health problems? That's probably why. After that intervention, if you want to call it that, Sartin agreed to get rid of all his literature, got rid of all his dark drawings, and it looked like he'd made a turn for the better. He kind of went too far, though. He was reserved, he didn't take part in his lessons well, didn't interact with other people. He sort of fell into his own shell, because what he wanted to do in his classes and his exams was the dark shit that he was no longer able to do. So as a result, he just became antisocial, I guess, is the best term I can use. It all appeared to be a mask, something put on to appease those around him. Internally, he probably still harboured all that hatred, that dark desire to unleash things and look into the things that everyone else considers taboo. In the summer of 1988, he went down to Dorset to visit his grandma. The peculiar thing about that is that on the way home, he persuaded his dad to stop off in Hungerford. Brian, none the wiser, remained in the car, while his son went on a dark tourism adventure, exploring all the locations where Michael Ryan killed his victims. In May 1989, after already pleading not guilty to murder, 17 new charges of attempted murder were brought forward. The problem was Sartin was not deemed fit enough to attend court. He was being held in a secure hospital, a psychiatric hospital, rather than a prison, and basically that would be where he remained for the rest of his life and to this date. Interviews with various hospital psychologists since then have revealed that Sartin has insisted that the voice of Michael Myers from the Halloween franchise was the person telling him to carry out that shooting on April 30th, 1989. The jury came back with a 10-2 majority verdict, deeming him unfit to stand trial, And after that, not much happened for a good few years. His case was reviewed behind closed doors in 1995 because at that point he still had all of the charges outstanding, but a year later a judge ordered him to spend the rest of his life in a secure hospital. It came to light that Sartin was suffering from schizophrenia and likely had been at the time of the shooting spree. In all likelihood, it's thought that Sartin had been experiencing symptoms of schizophrenia since the age of 13, with them getting progressively worse as the years went by. So severe and acute was his particular form of schizophrenia that the judge was left with no option but to send him to a secure hospital for the rest of his life. It's worth noting that now in 2024 he will be only about 57 years old, and his actions that day in 1989 will forever go down as a dark stain on the Whitley Bay area of Monkseaton. Well, that was it, the story of the Monkseaton shootings. Have you heard of that one before? Not many people have. Even people in the area are trying to forget that. They're likely still living with the ramifications of that, even if it's behind closed doors. If you enjoyed this video, I've put a couple of other suggested ones in the description. I might put a couple up here too. So if you want to check out more videos, I will try and do more going forward. We do cover exclusively British murder stories here on British Murders with me, your host Stuart Blues. Thanks so much for watching. Consider subscribing if you enjoyed the video. Give it a like, give it a share, all that good stuff. Leave a comment and I'll try to get back to you. Until next time, cheerio.